Max, good to see you. Glad you could join me on the podcast today.
Thank you so much.
Yeah, I'm always intrigued when obviously we're talking a little bit about, or we will be talking about politics in this and government specifically. And I'm always intrigued when there's interesting and fascinating ideas that I don't know if I necessarily agree with 100%, but I'm so glad that we can have these types of conversations, whether we agree or not, so we can come to some sort of conclusion. Because I don't think what we're doing right now seems to be working very well for the common man.
Right on. Couldn't agree more with that. Who knows what's before us? But yeah, I totally agree about that. It's not
Yeah.
working.
Well, you talk a lot about the concept of decentralized systems as a way to minimize big government. I think most people are probably familiar with it when it comes to state sovereignty, for example, over federal sovereignty. But it seems to me like you're talking about something even more decentralized than a state level. Am I understanding you correctly?
Certainly, yeah, that could be the case. Texas, for example, is a big state,
Right.
and Texas might want to be able to break up into further or other jurisdictions, depending on where someone lands and what they want their communities to look like, and the kind of rules and laws they want to instantiate in their communities as sovereign peoples.
What is how would you define community? Because that could be my neighborhood of 5 to 10 houses, or it could be a community of 100,000 people. So at what level are you advocating for with regards to the community level of governance?
Well, if you think about the stuff that we want to talk about as being in our community, we're talking about land and what sits on land. So some of the stuff in terra firma, it's important to think how do I want to live, and how do we want to instantiate, roads, lights, schools, local things, right? And how do we maximize everybody's participation in this at the most local feasible level? That is, of course, important in we're talking about territorial goods. But most of what we talk about when we think about a constitution is not territorial goods at all. So it kind of doesn't make any sense that I have to oblige my neighbor to live the exact way I do. And this is a crazy idea from this Belgian thinker named Dupuit, who wrote this in 1860. He's basically like, instead of you being a monarchist, a Republican, a Democrat, a whatever you like, why can't you just subscribe to your own sort of civil association? So we can have one sense of community, which is, hey, I need to get to know my neighbors. We need to look out for each other, and we can make collective decisions about what we want to see in our communities at a local scale. But the other sense of community is there are a bunch of people around the world who think maybe that people ought to be more sovereign in general, and treat that as a mission, right? And those sovereign people who are into the idea of self-sovereignty might be a sprinkle here and a handful there, but together they can self-organize under their own species of law. And they might not all be in the United States. Some might be in Canada, some might be on the other side of the world, but they share those values. So it's getting people to think about this idea of decoupling law from conquered territory, which is the way history is borne out. This would be a significant change from that.
Yeah, I'm wondering about, like, if we were to take this to the nth degree, it would be me deciding how I'm gonna basically live my life and lead myself. And although I can certainly make the case for that, there's also an inherent risk in that I could be a potential danger to the society, right? Or
Mm-hmm.
in this case, my neighborhood. If we're
That's
taking
right.
it down to a small area, I could say, well, I want that my neighbor's, whatever. So I'll just go ahead and walk into his house and grab his TV off the wall, and I'll go ahead and take that. Or I might have an issue with the junker that's sat out in my neighbor's yard for the past 2 years. I think there is some sort of consensus, and I'm not sure what level it's at, where we decide, hey, collectively, we're going to decide what's good for us as a whole. And that's the question I'm really trying to get at is, at what level or at what degree do we start enforcing some of what we think will be good for the collective?
Right. And that's a really great point. The way I would describe this, at least under my conception, and other people are going to have other conceptions. That's totally true.
Sure. Right.
We have this thing called the law of torts. Okay, the law of torts being a part of the common law, and what it says is, hey, you can't make anybody worse off by taking their property or hitting them in the face or throwing them in jail for if they're innocent. The only way you could do that is if you're defending someone or defending your own property. The problem is there's an asymmetry there with respect to the federal level of government in most countries. They take your stuff all the time. It's called taxation, right? Now, that's not to say that we might always in every case not want taxation. But what we're saying is that the level of government, maybe it's the state level, maybe it's the community level, that taxation, if taxation is necessary, it should be necessary where it's needed most, right?
And but who that gets way, to determine that? I mean, I think that's the point of the question. Well, sure, but if you get two people, you and I are going to, even if we agree on 99% of the things, we're not going to agree on 100%. So if you and I are in this community, for example, and by the way, I happen to agree with what you're saying. I'm just trying to see this from all perspectives and see to what degree it's taken. But if you and I agree 99% of the way about the way that our money pooled together should be spent, right. Let's say we want to bring a third party in and say, hey, you know what, Max, you and I, we're neighbors. You've got your family, I've got mine. We really care about our safety. So we're going to go ahead and hire a security force to make sure that it's protected between you and I. And I want to hire security force A and you want to hire security force B. Who decides?
Right. So the question is, and this would be resolved in courts, right? What level of government does that need to be determined?
Right. Correct.
It may be that we each want to hire our own protective associations and that they police our neighborhoods or look after us in whatever fashion they can in customer focused way. It may be that it's good to have a market in protective associations and that brings about the same level of competition that the market usually provides. Now, others might say, we don't want that. And we want to engage in an association where this is a shared or public good. And that's okay. If there are tensions between and among those associations, those can be resolved in courts. But in advance, you have to, once you are a signatory to a constitution of consent like this, or something where instead of law being imposed, you're part of a multilateral contract, you would then be able to sue a counterparty or someone who is opposite you who agreed to the same thing. Or if they're outside of your jurisdiction, there of course could be courts for resolving those disputes, and they would be at a higher level of government, like the Supreme Court. So it's not all just like crazy anarchy, right? It's about people self-selecting into their particular cultural or moral tribes, and then having that be wrapped in law that makes sure that there is peace and dispute resolution. Because right now what we're living in is in a case where everybody's fighting over the same set of authorities to try to impose their will on everybody else.
Right.
And you and I both know that ain't working. So even if you can poke holes in what I'm trying to do with this Constitution of Consent contest, even if we landed on something that is more like Switzerland, which is a very peaceful country, has a really good, long history of, relative peace, where the cantons, which are their version of a state, they're as powerful as the federal government. Most of the action is at the level of canton, and if you don't like it within Switzerland, you can vote with your feet. And that's sort of the American tradition that has been lost. We call it the 10th Amendment, right? In America, where everything is supposed to be carried out at the state, or at the level of the state or the level of the people, which is exactly what it says in the 10th Amendment. And yet how much of what the federal government does contravenes that? Almost everything. So what we have now in the Constitution that I cherish is simply not being respected, and power is acting with impunity. The sovereign men out there who are listening to this podcast know they can do better, and they are guaranteed it, not in the Constitution, but in the Declaration of Independence by Thomas Jefferson's pen, where Thomas Jefferson said, we have a right to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And to the extent that government doesn't allow us that, we have a right to abolish it. That is the consent of the governed passage in the Declaration of Independence. I've had a lot of folks question my patriotism for even doing this contest, the Constitution of Consent contest, which we can talk about in a moment. And I just say, hey, I'm a Jeffersonian. Don't question my patriotism. Question what this Constitution, even though I respect it, I venerate it almost as a sacred document, it's not working anymore. Maybe we need to start over in some fashion. And this just gets people. So even if we got something that where we respected the 10th Amendment again and the Constitution we have again and restrained federal power to the Constitution's mandate, that would be awesome. And if my little project had some hand in making that happen by changing the way people think back to the original ideals of the Republic, I think that'd be awesome. But I also want to say that I want to extend that to people in other countries. If you have Canadian listeners, absolutely. If you have Mexican listeners, absolutely. There are sovereign people all over the world who believe in the original project of the American founding.
I'm taking some notes here. I like the concept. I want to get back to your Constitution of Consent challenge or competition, but I liked what you said with regards to voting with your feet, because I think that's what we're beginning to see now. You see a mass exodus, for example, from California and New York into places like Florida and some of these other more conservative areas. We're seeing that now, and I think it isn't until the relative ease of modernity with regards to travel and commerce, digital commerce, that has paved the way for us to say, hey, if we don't like where we are, we have the opportunity to move. I think that was pretty restricted up until relatively recently with, again, transportation, with digital technology and the internet. And I could see us going down a path of civil disunion. And I hope it doesn't turn violent. That's certainly not what I would want, but I could see certain states or territories rallying around certain concepts. And if you don't like it, you're welcome to leave and go to the neighboring state. What are the downsides of something like that? Because right now, where we're a quote unquote United States of America, it seems to me that the biggest benefit of that is the power that we have with the dollar, which is weakening, especially in light of relatively recent developments with countries deciding to use other currency amongst themselves. And then, of course, just our physical safety and defense. But I'm not sure I see any other downsides than that. I'm curious what you think.
A downside to a dissolution of a more United States in favor of a more decentralized one? Yeah, yes. I think there are some potential downsides. If it weren't held together, I mean, and that's the reason I'm doing this project. You've probably heard the term national divorce, right?
Right.
It's sort of like this project is a way of talking about a national divorce done right instead of a national divorce done wrong. So let's say you have a national divorce done wrong. You could have a breakup of the Republic where it degenerates into warlordism or even, stuff like theocratic states forming. I used to live in Texas. I'm originally from North Carolina, was living in Texas, in Austin, which is its own little enclave, for 12 years or for 13 years rather. And now have just moved back to the Carolinas. I live in South Carolina now, which weirdly speaking was the state that first seceded during the, in advance of the Civil War
started. In South Carolina, right? Right.
Yeah. And someone who talks like me, you can hear my accent. I have that North Carolina accent. Someone who talks like me talking about baking secession into the Constitution sounds kind of crazy. Like this guy must be some sort of, guilt by association racist or whatever, which is not true at all. I definitely want at the federal level, something like what we talked about, tort law, you don't harm other people or their property, life, liberty, and property, to be baked in at the highest level of this particular regime. If you don't have that, you're going to have people saying, well, You in this state, you're going to join our state religion, which might be Protestantism, Catholicism, or whatever the majority is in that state. It could be something outlandish in some of these blue states, right?
Or red
Or
states. I mean, it could be outlandish just about anywhere.
It could be outlandish anywhere you cut it. You could have a theocracy in the red states, and you could have crazy social justice thinking in the blue states, and each of them trying to self-organize in antisocial ways, I guess you could say, or ways that don't hold together the integrity of a union at all. That could be bad. So you'd be able to vote with your feet, but you might have to escape with your feet, and that would be a hellish situation. We don't want warlordism, and we don't want internecine conflict. The point of this would be to create a situation of peace where we're not constantly fighting, crying our teardrop in the voting booth every 4 years to hope that the tide will turn. It never does. Instead, the special interests and politicians collude to shaft the rest of us, and then we fight each other. That's the situation we have now, and everybody knows it. So what are we going to do about it? And I think the answer is, if it's not this thing that I'm describing, at least what I'm doing could inspire somebody to do something else that returns us to a state where we have more local sovereignty. So we don't have to fight so much about what gets rammed down everybody's throat from Washington.
What do you feel then is the purpose of a federal government? I'm assuming, maybe I shouldn't assume, I guess I'll ask, is there a purpose for a federal government?
I mean, I think, the original interpretation of the Constitution gets a lot of things right. I don't think the purpose of the federal government from, like the 16th and 17th Amendments can go, which is, a tax that not only taxes your income, but takes the states out of the way for getting that income. Because when you have states being able to take income in and give it to the federal government for its purposes, then you have another check on power. If they're violating their mandate, the states can say, nope, we have the sovereignty to say you don't get any more of our tax money until you resolve that. So there's stuff like that is already in the Constitution that makes it great. Don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. Even if you enter my contest, know that there's a lot of value in the Constitution, but some of the amendments that have been added, like income tax that takes the states out of the equation, and the introduction of senators instead of state legislatures, are crappy. And they have helped create the federal beast that we have now. Now, your original question was, remind me again.
Are you referring to the purpose of the federal government? That question?
Yeah. Sorry.
Okay.
Thank you. That's what I was getting to. So the federal government does do a lot of important things, but what it does and is supposed to do versus what it does are two very different things. What it is supposed to do in honoring the Constitution, particularly Amendment 10, is to restrict all of the things that the government can't, or the government authorities at that highest level cannot do. It should oblige itself to obey its own rules, which it doesn't do.
Well, what would be an example of that?
Well, I mean, have anything to, where in the Constitution do you see anything about healthcare? Right? That should be a state level phenomenon. If you want to have some alternative systems of healthcare that are more similar to places like Singapore, where you oblige people to, instead of giving FICA taxes to pay for Medicare and Medicaid and Social Security, people are obliged to set aside money in medical savings accounts and purchase. Even if you were a little authoritarian about it at the local level, you could experiment with different kinds of measures based on the cultural communities of which you're a member. And those experiments can be replicated. The more we try to impose blanket policies, one size fits all, the one true way on everybody, the more we conflict with each other about what that way is, because we all have different ideas of it. So the federal government, if it were to realize its mandate, is really to protect the sovereignty of the states and of the people. That's one thing. Maybe one could argue that it's also to protect the totality of the republic in terms of our land. But I might even argue that polycentric defense would be better because you could start to inject market mechanisms. Right now, we have a bloated empire around the world and an executive power to go to war that contravenes the Constitution every single day. War powers lie with Congress, not the executive. And yet, when's the last time we declared war on another country? Our military veterans are getting shafted left and right by this military industrial complex and the politicians that feed off of it.
Yeah, I actually
Sorry,
wrote this down here.
Yeah.
No,
Sorry, I
this
didn't
is
mean
good
to go
stuff.
crazy on you, but I get passionate.
Yeah, I don't feel like you did. I feel like you're sharing things that are like you said, passionate to you. I actually wrote this down before you mentioned it, and I said, even in the Constitution, we talk about the separation of powers, executive, legislative, and judicial. I get frustrated when Biden signs executive orders just as much as I got frustrated when Trump did it, just as much as I got frustrated when Obama and Bush and Clinton signed executive orders. That's not how the Constitution works. So my question then is, if we have these checks and balances currently in place with our Constitution, and they're not being followed, then why creating a new Constitution would we expect any different?
Well, this goes back to the question about Jefferson, right? Jefferson realized already after his first term that there was a serious constitutional crisis developing, and he warned about it before. He was in France when the Constitution was ratified in 1789. But he warned, he was like, you have this general welfare clause, you have these other clauses that are going to allow power to make a bunch of mischief. Okay. And of course, he had written the Declaration, and I already talked about the things that he said in the Declaration. And that, of course, all the American founders signed, and were scared they were going to get hung for it, right? But the thing is, if you can opt into law, right? Like if you can be an actual signatory, you're signing a contract, which is to say you are making a commitment that is enforceable, then every single person who is a signatory to that contract is legally liable for not holding up your end of the bargain in terms of responsibilities, and has recourse in terms of those who have been charged with protecting your rights. So my belief is that we will trust the institutions we build and use together. And if someone were to enter this contest that I'm running and try to win $20,000 or maybe 3,000 or 2,000 second and third, you could take the Constitution we have now, take out all of the bad stuff that's been added, and all the original stuff that maybe wasn't working so well, like the General Welfare Clause or interpretations of the Commerce Clause and things like that, and do some fixes. That's the kind of thing we're looking for. It's a means of changing our mindsets around how this could be better, because otherwise we're just sitting here going, well, it doesn't work now, but I get how could having a new Constitution work better? I don't know. It just means let's sit on our hands or try to go up against the most powerful regime in the world, as people with pistols and AK-47s or whatever. I mean, like, Joe Biden made fun of people who are in militias and things like that, who are deeply, deeply wedded to the original notion of the constitutional republic, and are worried about the accretion of state power. And he made fun of it in a speech. He was like, what are you going to do? We have F-16s. Mm-hmm. I would remind him that we would probably do the same thing that the Afghanis did when they ran his ass out of Afghanistan. And our military was in a 20-year meat grinder to try to make that nation build over there. But I think that if people are dedicated to the ideals that I believe a lot of Americans hold dear, that they would jealously guard that new Constitution. And in time, that might wane. In time, there might be another need. But going back to Jefferson, Jefferson actually thought that you might need to reconstitute the republic every 20 years and turn out the
I didn't know
powerful
that.
with that level of frequency. I don't know if that's the case, but empires fall. We've seen it in Rome. We've seen it in Britain. The way the Indians overturned the British Raj in 1945, I think, was through peaceful means, satyagraha. Now, what they instantiated afterwards wasn't that great. The Nehru regime was terrible, and they all got poor very quickly. But that's not to say they weren't right to underthrow power the way they did. And I use underthrow instead of overthrow because overthrow is violent, underthrow is peaceful.
That's the distinction between the two for you.
Yes, sir.
Got it. What happens to those individuals who decide, because you're talking about signing this quote unquote legal binding contract in this new constitution of consent? What happens to those individuals who say, no, I'm not interested in that?
They'll have basic rights afforded to them that would be covered on stuff like the common law. So there would be a kind of a unilateral granting them basic rights. You can't run roughshod over people and expect not to be sued or not to have some sort of recourse. But so there would be certain provisions that they would not have to. There would be certain provisions that they would not be able to expect. So it would not be imposed; it would be chosen.
Yeah, this kind of reminds me a little bit of a union, for example, where you have a worker who decides, well, I'm not going to join a union, which I can certainly understand why. But the advocate for the union says, well, this individual is going to reap all the benefits without having to make any of the sacrifice. And that's a whole other conversation. I'm not advocating for unions by any means. Please do not misunderstand me. But this
no,
is
I get
the
what you're
potential.
saying.
This is the potential argument: is you have an individual who's like, I'm not going to sign that. I'll reap all the benefits of what you guys are doing, but I'm not going to be held liable for any of that.
Well, it's easier to do something like that when you have local stuff, and that's why local, sort of like municipal rules or laws will be made look differently or have a different character than national stuff. Because it's easier to free ride locally than it is nationally. But that's all going to depend on how that original social contract. You'll hear a lot of people talk about the social contract, and it's almost never a real contract, right? It's something that they've dreamed up in their mind and thinks sounds wonderful, the social contract. And it comes out of a very fine tradition going back to Locke and Thomas Hobbes. But real social contracts are an artifact of people's choice and consent, and that makes it a lot stronger. We have people who sit on neighboring states all the time, and there are conflicts, and those are resolved in courts. I see it as very much the same way. Courts can resolve these and build it into precedent, the way you resolve these kind of frictions between and among those subsidiary jurisdictions, even if someone is not a signatory to the Constitution. But in some sense, affording people basic rights is kind of like a thing you want to do anyway, if that makes sense, even if they don't.
I don't
sign.
think we even afford them. If I think we decide collectively we're going to preserve them, because no individual can grant me a right. We can only work to protect those rights. They're given to me through God. So you can't afford me anything. You can just work to protect it.
I appreciate the spirit of that. And yet at the end of the day, pragmatically speaking, the powers that be, in collusion with corporations and special interests, are taking away our rights every day systematically.
I agree, but that doesn't undermine my argument that the right is derived from God. But you're absolutely right, is that there are those bad actors who are deliberately and intentionally, for their own selfish pursuits, working to strip those rights from me. So I don't think I don't think we're far apart in our agreement. Maybe just the semantics we're using about where rights are derived from.
Yeah, and look, I return to the Declaration. Life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness is based on Lockean's. We're endowed by our Creator, it says, right? So that as a body of law, if you think of the Declaration of Independence as being a dual charter with the Constitution, then you're absolutely right. Whatever your theological perspective, that's what the law says. Even if you don't believe in God, this is the way we're doing things. Does that make sense? So I wouldn't even want to get into a theological discussion about the purpose, about where rights come from, except to say, acknowledge what you're saying and saying, yes, as far as we're concerned right now, if you're an American, that is the law. The Declaration of Independence ought to be considered part of the body of law.
I think it's important to the degree that we recognize that where it comes from and that it's objective and that there's a standard, and then we can work to administer it how best we can as flawed humans. Not that it's our purpose or even our place to issue rights to other individuals or say what they can and can't do. I just don't have the authority to do that.
Exactly. That on that we agree. All I'm saying is that's the way the powerful think, is
Sure,
that
good
they
point. Fair
allocate
enough.
rights.
Yeah, fair
And we've
enough.
got to do something about that. And if you're, to the extent that you're, you have religious listeners, I hope that we can all collectively become instruments of God's will instantiating rights and freedoms again in this country, and indeed the world, to the extent it's possible. And that's the cool thing about this, a constitution of consent, is it's not just our God-given rights aren't just for Americans anymore. It's for anybody who wants to live under its auspices. And we can have a constellation of people all over the world who live by and through the original Charter of Human Rights, which is the Declaration, and thus also the Constitution,
Well, I like
properly
that you're
applied.
yeah, and I like that you're talking about this because I've seen a tremendous problem, we'll say. I spent some time in the military. I was in Iraq in 2005 and 2006, and you know what I get really frustrated with
Thank you.
is the West, specifically America, trying to dictate what other countries and other people should do. It's not my responsibility to instill or install democracy or republic in some foreign country that just isn't interested in it. That's not my responsibility. That's not our responsibility. Our responsibility is to take care of our own. And that's not to say that we can't go out and do missionary work and proselyte and share concepts and ideas, which even our founders did as they traveled outside of the United States to foreign countries to spread the message, spread the word, share and learn. But it's not our place to forcefully go somewhere and instill or install something that people aren't interested in.
I absolutely agree. Not only that, but coming from the mouth of a former service member, of a vet, it becomes all the more powerful what you're saying. And I wish more people would listen to you.
Well, it's a hard thing to say, especially for a lot of veterans, because uh, veterans derive, as they should, derive a lot of their value from their service to country. And I think it's noble work. I think it's honorable. I think there's sacrifices that need to be made. And I think for the most part, the work that's being done is good. But also, there's some places we need not be involved, and we need to learn to protect and take care of our own before we start forcefully executing these types of things on other people.
Amen. Couldn't agree more. And I'll tell you, I was a cheerleader for the Iraq War. At first, I believed what came out of the national security establishment, and I was all too willing to send guys like you into that meat grinder. And I have deep regrets about it, honestly. But I still appreciate your service, and everybody who undertakes that. They swear an oath to uphold the Constitution. The problem is the powers that deploy uh, guys like you were and are not. They're violating their oath to the Constitution almost
Mm.
daily.
Tell me a little bit about this contest that you have going on. So the Constitution of Consent, I'd like to know a little bit more specifically about what that is and some of the parameters that you're looking for, and even who determines what is accurate and what is not. What is the best constitution crafted? Who gets to decide that?
Yeah, I mean, me and a couple of my buddies get to decide, because
Just
that's
just
yeah,
some guys
like
getting together, like draft over fantasy football or something, or there's some
that's
like actual parameters here.
yeah, it's sort of like, I mean, I'm not gonna sit here and pat myself on the
I mean, it's
shoulder
your
and
money. You
say,
can do whatever you want, right? You're the
well,
one funding it. So
I was able to raise the money from a donor, from a
got it.
couple of donors actually. So it's $25,000. The top prize is 20,000, and then second and third are 3,000 and 2,000 respectively for second and third prizes.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, the first thing we want to do is get people to think about the idea of what it means to be free, right? What it means to be free. Just to remind ourselves of that. We don't live in a state of affairs anymore where we are anything but the timid herds being shunted around, poked and prodded by the powerful. Everybody has become acutely aware of that. Doesn't matter what side of the fence you're on, unless a side of the political aisle you're on. Everybody is acutely aware of this. So, the idea behind this contest is, first, let's get people to think about Constitution craft again. Let's get people to think about not only the original meaning of the Constitution that has been almost wholly abandoned, but about the ideas that animated the Declaration at all. So it is a way of being a pamphleteer, like Tom Paine or like Thomas Jefferson, to be a pamphleteer again, to help people burn fires in the mind with these ideals, returning to our core doctrine, if that makes sense. What does it really mean to be an American is what it means to be free. How do we engage, not in politics? Politics is like waking up in the morning, opening up your smartphone and finding two apps, red app and blue app. And which am I going to get to use for the next 4 years? That is not a social operating system worth having anymore. If that's if democracy is the golden calf, I'm not about it anymore, right? So it's getting people to fully to confront the fact that that's kind of the state of affairs we're living in now, which we're getting shunted into these occasional elections that are red versus blue, which is politics, when we need to be able to think in meta politics terms again, where meta politics is understanding the dynamics that make our society what it is, with all its pathologies and all of the accretions of power at the highest echelons. Why is that happening? If I can get people to think about that by getting them to think about what a more perfect union would look like, or what a more perfect society would look like, it has to originate in morality and good rules. And that is the point of the contest and even if all I ever did was inspire someone to come up with a single constitutional amendment that allowed us something of a reboot of the Republic, I'd be over the moon. I'd turn backflips. So this is not a way, excuse my mouth, to shit on the Constitution. It is rather a way to honor it and get people around the world to think about the question, how are we to live together, and what does it mean to be free?
I
And
like
by the
that
way,
sorry,
just really quickly, by the way, this is also not partisan, because at the most local feasible level, you might want to put together a kibbutz, a commune, a religious organization, whatever it is. And as long as that's not contravening, some enumerated right, like, religious freedom, if you want to self-organize into some religious community and pool your resources and have a commune like a kibbutz or like the Mennonites do already in this country, then why not do that? That's your conception of the good. It facilitates people self-organizing into their conceptions of the good. And that can be on the left, it can be on the right, and it can be everything in between.
Well, I'm glad you're saying this because you used a couple of phrases that I wanted to mention. You said for morality and good rules, you almost spoke as if it's truth with a capital T. Now, I believe it is because of our previous conversation. It's derived from an objective source that is unshakable, unflappable. A lot of people don't believe that. So what I think is good, or what I think is a quote unquote good rule or morality, not everybody's going to agree with. That's a subjective term for a lot of people.
That's right. And there's nothing I can do about that, but I hope to persuade them that there is a sense that what I'm trying to do is say, okay, at the end of the day, you might be right. Maybe it isn't objective, but from as of this guy's subjectivity and Ryan's subjectivity, we can find intersubjective agreement about the idea that life, liberty, property, and the pursuit of happiness are core ideals to our very existence. And we are going to form a moral political community together. And you don't have a say about that if you disagree with it. Right? So, yes, we want to persuade as many people as possible to adopt these ideas, these negative rights, if you will. But to the extent they become people of another country, like the Iraqis that you encountered on a day-to-day basis when you were over there, who may not want this stuff, right? But the framework that we would establish is to say there are multiple peaceable kingdoms that live together harmoniously, and if there are frictions between and among them, they go into the common law courts. And that is a way of having not be involved in this culture wars and other kinds of political warfare that we've red versus blue stuff that we've been living in for ages. And all of us purple and yellow and other kind of people, the way we think about things is, hey, the system we have, politics as we know it, does not serve our evolution as people. What would serve our evolution as people is to give us the right to self-organize into communities of practice with people we love and respect, with rules that we want to adopt within a framework of rights and freedoms where these groups can't go to war with each other. That's it.
A lot of what you're talking about sounds like powerful thought experiments. Is there a pragmatic approach to underthrowing what we currently see, or is there a path rather than just a thought experiment? Is there an actual path to redemption with our current system, or underthrowing our current system in order to replace it with something that might be more effective, which
all kinds of
obviously is
ways.
subject to interpretation? But what is the path forward?
That is such a great question. Thank you, because it allows me to talk about underthrow again. Right first, yes, absolutely. There might be something as simple as, okay, we want to we have some national crisis. Maybe it's an economic crisis, and this represents. I hate to say this. This sounds like the old mayor of Chicago who used to work for Barack Obama, whose name escapes me, but he said, "Never let a crisis go to waste." Right, and that's how you got some of the garbage that came out during the Obama administration. But the idea here, there's a sense in which that is right. So if we had some sort of catastrophic collapse where the federal government no longer had the funds or the means to use debt spending to do what it does, we would then have the opportunity to become self-sovereigns again. So here's an example of underthrow that is just one narrow vector. Okay. Remember in about 2012, it would have been illegal to hitch a ride with somebody. And all of a sudden, some subversive innovator, is what I call them, comes up with this idea. Okay, what if we patch together GPS, some sort of identity that's associated with a credit card and this and that, and paired drivers together with riders in a reputation system that looks like something you would find on Amazon, say. Then all of a sudden, hitching a ride was not only taboo, but in some respects overturned taxi medallion cartels, right?
Yeah.
Taxi medallions no longer held their
Any
government
value.
instituted cartels. Yeah, they were completely. That is a vector of underthrow called subversive innovation. So the thing that I try to do with Underthrow, my Substack, which you can find at underthrow.org, I'd love for your listeners to check it out, is to think in these kind of terms. What are the legal gray areas in which we can operate to do one simple thing? Another is, well, this is not a simple thing, but another is Bitcoin. Satoshi Nakamoto was probably 3 or 4 guys who were corresponding, and eventually they patched together a system that allowed a sovereign store of value, a digital commodity that could compete with the dollar that is losing its value. Now, there's this thing called Gresham's Law that makes it so that you have incentives not to spend Bitcoin and to spend your dollars, and that creates sort of economic distortions on net. But the idea is Bitcoin became a proof of concept where sovereign individuals could enter into a collective arrangement around something they agreed to and agreed upon, which is a set of rules, the code of Bitcoin, to forge an alternative in a permissionless way to the fiat currency system. And they did it, and they're still doing it 14 years later. It's 15 years later, I guess now. And it's an amazing advance. That is Underthrow. That is subversive innovation. It could be a man like Bob Luddy out of North Carolina, who started a chain of, or a franchise of schools called Thales Academy, where he offers school children top quality education for $5,000 a year. 20% of his students have scholarships, so they can afford to go there, despite the fact that we have a free system of public education that fails over and over again and doesn't change. They add more money to the public education and hire more administrators, and nothing ever changes. The outcomes have been the same. Luddy says, go with God, do your thing. It's unfortunate that we have to do this, but I'm going to create this thing over here, and my kids are going to excel. And they do. They have a tremendous rating for success because they brought an entrepreneurial lens to it. And it's about, for me, it's not about politics, policy, and punditry anymore. That stuff doesn't work. It's about creativity, entrepreneurship, and innovation. And that's what the kind of men, and and women too, but particularly your listeners are mostly men, can hope to do for this country, is become subversive innovators. They use their creativity, entrepreneurship, and innovation to make social change around and outside the political process. And this contest is just one example of that, as legal innovation.
No, those are great. Those are some really great examples. So I'm glad you should. When you talked about it, did you say Gresham's Law? Gresham's Law?
Yeah, GRESHAM''S. Gresham.
Okay, got it. I'm gonna look into that because I have been curious. I personally own Bitcoin, and I have been curious as to why it hasn't taken off to the degree that I thought it would. That's to your point, or this law. Nobody spend. I don't spend it. I leave it. I leave it there. I leave it alone. I spend my dollars. So that's kind of an interesting concept.
Yeah. It's there's a term that comes out of Gresham's Law, which is bad money chases bad money. What is it? Bad money chases away good money, or something like that. But essentially, the idea is you want to use the crappier money first because it's losing its value. Right. Whereas the more stable, there's volatility because of the interactions.
Sure.
But if you had a basic Bitcoin standard, which we can argue about, all the Bitcoin maxis, I'm a Bitcoin mostly. There are people called Bitcoin maxis, maximalists, and they can argue about this stuff all day. all day long. But there are dynamics in the interplay of the different types of money that create these sort of strange distortions. But if everybody were to use sort of Bitcoin as its base money, you wouldn't see so many of these type of phenomena. It'd still have deflationary effect, but you wouldn't have so much volatility.
Yeah.
It'd be a
Yeah,
wider adoption. Yeah.
The gentleman you were talking about earlier is I'm not I'm using gentleman very liberally, but Rahm Emanuel is who you were suggesting earlier. So that's who you were talking about.
Yeah, thanks.
Yeah, you bet. Well, Max, why don't you tell the guys where to connect with you, where to learn more about what you're doing, obviously look into the contest, and how to get more information.
Sure thing. Underthrow.org is my publication. Most everything there is free. Obviously, I would love to have free subscribers. It's sort of like the kind of stuff that rattles around in my mind and the minds of those people I love and admire. I'll publish other people's work sometimes on the site. It's called underthrow.org. You can also find the contest there. Right at the top in the nav bar, it'll say contest. Click on that and it'll give you specifications for how that'll put you in a better position to win the contest. I'd love to see that too. And finally, I would love, honestly, Ryan, I'm kind of inspired by doing this podcast because of your focus on men and sort of reconstituting the idea of what it means to be a good man. That is something I've been thinking about doing with my kids. So if any of your listeners want to reach out to me and say, like, does it make sense to reconstitute something like the fraternal system, where fraternity is really a brotherhood of men? I'm really interested in that. At the center of that can be our patriotic ideals as Americans, but also the cultivation of proud, courageous, and effective men in this society who are getting crap from every turn. I feel
no doubt. Yeah, I mean that fraternal. I mean that's part of why we call this order of man, the order fraternity. And it's so I'm with you on that. We got to talk more about that maybe offline.
Awesome.
Max, we'll sync it all up. I appreciate you. I love new ideas, new ways of looking at things, even controversial approaches. It's like, all right, well, let's talk about it. Let's uncover it. Let's figure it out. Let's weigh the pros and cons and hash through it and debate and do whatever we need. Because I'm with you. I'm sick of the status quo and I don't think it's working. So I appreciate men like you who are willing to put it out there and try something and put it on the line a little bit. I'm sure you get a lot of flack for what you're talking about. And I'm sure you're under the scrutiny of certain watch lists. We'll go ahead and leave that right there for now. But I do appreciate you, Max. Thanks for joining me today.
Man, thank you so much, Ryan. I just want to thank you not only for your service from before, but your service now. You're doing a good stuff. You're doing really good stuff. So thank you.